here in the hang, we have Kunal Bhatia, who is also a business owner with Slides Up, who is one of the startups that signed on to a letter from 160 startups organized by Engine Advocacy today, calling on the Senate to schedule a vote on the Save the Internet Act. And I believe we also have Chris Mitchell, who's a good friend of mine, from the Institute for Self-Reliance, who I know has done a tremendous amount of work on things like local broadband and other issues that are impacted by this. So Chris and Kunal, are you both here?
Yeah, hey, it's good to see you, Evan.
Awesome, and hopefully I'm getting everyone's name correct. We got a million guests today, and my team is basically like pinging me, being like, "All right, here's who's on next." But guys, you know, since I got both of you, I'll just sort of pose a quick question. I mean, maybe just each start kind of at a personal level. You know, why does this matter to you? Obviously, there's a million different issues that we could work on today. You know, there's the environment, there's human rights, there's criminal justice reform, there's healthcare, so many important things. You know, so why is the open internet and net neutrality something that is important enough to you that you're spending a lot of time working on it? And maybe Chris, we'll start with you, and then Kunal will go to you right after.
Sure thing.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, for me, I think it comes down to this sense of when it's gone, it's gone. You know, we've seen different technologies, radio and television are two major ones they came in with this tremendous promise of enhancing our democracy and came under centralized control. And now I don't know very many people that actually still listen to major radio stations because it's so clearly run for the benefit of a few corporations that control it and not really about supporting the communities. You know, television, I think, if you think of the traditional television, has gone that way too. Technology is actually, once again, giving us an opportunity to see what it can do with a flourishing marketplace in some ways. So my concern is once we have toll booths, it's going to be hard to get rid of them. You know, our expectation is a free and open internet, and I want to keep it that way. I want to make sure that kids grow up with a sense that they can do whatever they want and not thinking it's acceptable that you know, some monopoly chooses for them how they use it.
For me, at least, it's been both a personal issue and I don't know if you can hear me.
I got you, Kunal. I think Evan maybe.
Yeah, we can hear you. It looks like Evan dropped. I apologize. She'll be right back, but please continue.
Okay. So yeah, for me, it's been both a personal and a business issue. So I'm currently working on an internet startup, Slides Up, and I first got engaged by the Engine, like Evan had mentioned earlier, basically to prevent the repeal of net neutrality last year. And as a internet startup and just someone who's been benefactor of the innovation economy, I think it's super important to keep these net neutrality protections in place. Even if you forget the consumer arguments that had been made earlier in the day on the live stream, there really wouldn't be anything to protect on the internet if you didn't save startups and people doing great innovation on the internet. There would be nothing worth saving. And so I think it starts there, and it certainly goes downstream to the consumer aspects as well. We certainly need to protect consumers and make sure they have open and affordable access to the internet, and you know, not charge people based on which sites they want to go to and which sites, you know, are just not available to them. That would be, you know, ludicrous. Beyond that, consumers like myself who benefited from the innovation economy can then, you know, go and become a startup founder or someone that you know, benefits from the internet in some way. And so there's very much a crossover between people who are just consuming and also producing things on the internet.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Kunal. Y'all, I don't know if y'all noticed or not, but I I got booted basically while you were talking, and then took a minute to get myself back in. But I caught the tail end of what you were saying there. And I guess, Kunal, can you talk, if you didn't already, can you just briefly talk about the letter that was sent to the Senate this morning from the startups?
Certainly. So the Engine is an organization that's advocating for this and many other issues. And they came together with startups from around the US, as well as larger companies like Stripe, Pinterest, Etsy, everyone who's basically invested in growing the GDP of the internet. And basically the whole premise of the letter was to encourage Senator Mitch McConnell and the other senators to bring this back to a vote, the Save the Internet Act. And it basically will bring back the protections that were repealed this day last year for net neutrality. And so the House, I believe, has already passed this legislation, and now we'd like to bring it back into the Senate and have a vote, and hopefully bring these protections back in. So major thank you to the Engine and everyone there for putting it together.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, Kunal. And Chris, going back to you, I mean, I know you've worked on a wide range of issues, and I think one of the things that I often hear from folks who are a little skeptical about net neutrality is they're like, well, isn't the real solution just that we just need more choices? If there was just more internet service providers, then if one of them started blocking content, then you could just go pick another one. So is that, a solution? Is that the reality on the ground right now? Why do you think net neutrality protections are necessary? And what do you think the future of ensuring that everyone has access to the internet looks like?
Well, I think it's a seductive point in some ways. I think that when you live in a society where we have such limited competition in so many important areas, we start to think that improving competition and having real choices will solve all of our problems. But one of the, I think, most insightful comments I've heard on that area comes from Harold Feld from Public Knowledge, who reminds us that even though we have lots of competition selling used cars, for instance, that we still need laws that protect us from lemons. I'm actually a huge advocate for markets and how we can use markets to solve problems, but we still need basic protections because some people have more information than others, and they could use that to take advantage. And so, I think there's work by Barbara Van Schevick from Stanford, who's looked at Europe, where she's said where they have good competition, there's still evidence that they need these protections to protect net neutrality because of common incentives that even in a competitive environment, many ISPs may have to each engage in some form of discrimination. So, I very much want to move to a world, I mean, as you know, from my work focused on municipal broadband, in many ways, I think that this can solve the problem. But when California and Sacramento recently changed some laws around muni broadband last year, they introduced a requirement that cities would have to abide by net neutrality if they built their own municipal networks. And I was comfortable with that. Like, I don't mind that. I think it's smart because I don't think anyone should be, picking and choosing the winners, as we often say in economics, on the internet, except for the users themselves.
And tell me, I'm curious, how do these internet service providers that claim that they support competition, how do they behave around the issue of municipal broadband? Are they using their lobbying power to make it easier for municipalities to set up their own broadband networks? Are they, encouraging policies that enable, competition and, folks like you and me to start up our own ISP if we wanted to, or what are they doing?
No, the big companies in particular, the ones that buy their influence, the ones that are often the most hated companies in America on polls, they're doing everything they can to slow down competition. When it comes to municipal networks, they use arguments that are very specifically focused on people's distrust of government. And so they will spend millions of dollars lobbying. They'll even spend hundreds of thousands or up to $1 million in some cases in individual cities to try to prevent them from building their own networks. And I think that reason is pretty obvious. I mean, these companies don't want to admit that they're against competition. But fundamentally, if a company like AT&T or Comcast decided to lobby in favor of competition, I think there'd be a shareholder revolt. Our system is set up in such a way that that would actually be against the interests of Comcast. And so, I think a key lesson for our elected officials and for people to keep in mind when they're reaching out to and talking to their elected officials is that Comcast and AT&T should not be listened to on these issues, or at least they shouldn't carry the day. I certainly wouldn't want to deny any individual or corporation the ability to express their views, but we have to understand they're speaking from their own very narrow self-interest, and we need to listen to people and the businesses that are really important in this and stand to have the most to lose if we don't have an open internet.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Sorry for the delay there. Always trying to unmute myself while we're running a few different things here. Last question for you all, and then I think we have another guest who's about to join shortly. But we do have a lot of startups and web companies that are helping spread the word today. Reddit and Tumblr and Imager and Airbnb and Twitter and Boing Boing and a number of sites. But you will notice that Facebook, Google, Amazon, some of the largest Silicon Valley companies are not really helping out anymore, not really talking about net neutrality. For someone who represents the startup community, how do you view this? How does net neutrality ensure that startups and small businesses have the ability to compete with the largest players in the internet ecosystem? And what do you think the internet will be like in a few years if these net neutrality protections are not restored?
Certainly, and there's a lot to unpack there, Evan. I think first and foremost, I think Facebook, Amazon, all the larger companies are really doing themselves a disservice in not promoting net neutrality and speaking out for it, because ultimately a lot of their innovation these days will come from startups that they're acquiring. And so they should be incentivized if they're going to create the future businesses of tomorrow, like they have already today, then they should be encouraging net neutrality. Obviously, they have a vested interest in that, suppose net neutrality goes away, they can now pay to play, and they can pay all the big bucks that are necessary to make sure that their services load faster, that people can access their websites more freely, and all that comes with the money. So I think it's really in the best interest of policymakers to take away those incentives and not even allow them to think in that way. Because if that's available, then there will be companies who take advantage. And certainly as a startup owner, I don't have the type of resources that, say, a Facebook or an Amazon would have to make sure that my website loads fast. And as a designer as well, page load times make a huge difference. It's something like 40% of people will drop off from your site if you lose them or don't load a page within 3 to 5 seconds. That's huge. And so I think all of these factors combined, I really hope that both large and small businesses alike come together and fight for net neutrality. So I appreciate all the efforts that you've been doing, that my Senator Ed Markey has been doing to get this pushed through.